March 7, 1945, 3:56 in the afternoon. The town of Remagen, Western Germany. The Rhine River flows cold and gray beneath a sky heavy with the threat of rain. On the eastern bank, the Ludendorff Bridge, a massive railway span of steel and stone built during the Great War, stretches across the water like an iron sentinel. Its twin towers rise nearly 70 feet above the river, Gothic and imposing, designed to carry trains laden with troops and supplies to the Western Front 3 decades earlier. Now, in the dying light of a March afternoon, it carries something else, the last hope of the Wehrmacht's defense of the German heartland. On the western approach, a German engineer officer named Captain Willy Brodtke stands at a detonation control point, his hand resting on a wooden box containing the electrical firing mechanism. The box is connected by wire to demolition charges embedded in the bridge's structure, 600 kilograms of industrial explosive carefully placed at critical support points. Brodtke has rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. When the order comes, he will turn the key, press the plunger, and the Ludendorff Bridge will collapse into the Rhine, denying the Americans the one thing they need most, an intact crossing over the last great natural barrier protecting the industrial heart of Germany. But Captain Brodtke is troubled. The charges were supposed to have been upgraded days ago. The primary explosives are industrial dynamite, not military grade, and some of them are old, their chemical stability questionable. The backup fuses are unreliable. His requests for better materials have been denied or ignored. The Reich is collapsing, supply chains are in chaos, and there are no more reserves, no more reinforcements, no more anything. He has a bridge to destroy and insufficient means to destroy it. And now, through the afternoon mist, he can hear the sound that every German soldier on the Western Front has learned to dread, the rumble of American armor approaching. The sound grows louder, closer. Tank engines, half-tracks, the mechanical thunder of an army that has crossed France, Belgium, and now stands at the threshold of Germany itself. Captain Brodtke looks at the detonator box, then at the bridge, then across the river to where civilians are still fleeing eastward carrying what little they can salvage from the inferno their nation has become. He is supposed to wait for the order, wait until the last possible moment, but the Americans are coming, and if he waits too long, they will take the bridge, and if they take the bridge, the war, Germany's war, the war he has fought since 1939, will be over within weeks instead of months. He does not yet know that within hours, this bridge, this unremarkable railway crossing in a small town no one has ever heard of, will become the most important piece of real estate in Europe, that its capture will render irrelevant every defensive plan the German High Command has drawn up for the Rhine defense, that Adolf Hitler in his bunker beneath Berlin will order 5 officers executed for its loss, that American soldiers will risk their lives to hold it while German forces throw everything they have, artillery, aircraft, frogmen, V-2 rockets, at its destruction, and that 10 days from now, the bridge will collapse anyway, killing 28 American engineers, but by then it will no longer matter because the Rhine will have been crossed, the heartland breached, and the myth of the impregnable river barrier shattered forever.
Captain Willy Brodtke waits for his order. The Americans are 2 kilometers away, then 1 kilometer, then 500 meters, and the order does not come. And when it finally comes, it will be too late, because in war, as in life, the difference between victory and catastrophe is often measured not in hours or minutes, but in seconds. And the Ludendorff Bridge will fall to American hands in the seconds when German indecision met American audacity, when hesitation met momentum, when the myth of security met the reality of defeat. The Rhine was supposed to be secure. Every German soldier, every officer, every general believed it. The river was wide, swift, and deep. The bridges were wired for demolition. The defenses were prepared. The Americans would have to conduct massive river crossings under fire, operations that would take weeks and cost thousands of lives. The Rhine would buy time, time for the miracle weapons to arrive, time for the Allies to fracture, time for something, anything, to change the trajectory of the war. But in 3:56 in the afternoon, on March 7, 1945, Captain Willy Brodge stands at his detonator box and realizes that time has run out. The myth is about to die, and with it, Germany's last hope of avoiding total annihilation. To understand why the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became one of the most decisive moments of the war's final phase, one must first understand the strategic significance the German High Command placed on the Rhine River as a defensive barrier. After the Allied breakout from Normandy and the subsequent liberation of France and Belgium, the Rhine represented the final natural obstacle before the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, and beyond that, the road to Berlin itself. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, had repeatedly stressed that the Rhine must be held at all costs. Every bridge across the river was to be prepared for demolition. Every crossing point was to be defended to the last man. The Americans and British would be forced to conduct opposed river crossings, massive amphibious operations that would take time, resources, and lives. The German defensive strategy was predicated on a simple calculation: time. If the Rhine could delay the Allied advance by even a few weeks, perhaps the miracle weapons, the jet aircraft, the new U-boats, the V-2 rockets would turn the tide. Perhaps the Western Allies would come to their senses and join Germany in fighting the real enemy, the Soviets. Perhaps something, some deus ex machina, would intervene. It was magical thinking, divorced from reality, but it was the only thinking left to a regime that had long since abandoned rational strategy.
The Ludendorff Bridge was not considered particularly important in this defensive scheme. It was a railway bridge, not suitable for heavy vehicle traffic without modification. The approaches were narrow and easily defended. German planners assumed that even if the Americans reached Remagen, they would bypass it in favor of larger crossing points further north or south. The bridge was wired for demolition, yes, but it was not the priority. Resources were scarce, and there were other bridges, other crossings, that seemed more critical. This was the first fatal error, because when Lieutenant Karl Timmerman of the U.S. 9th Armored Division crested the hill overlooking Remagen at approximately 1 p.m. on March 7th and saw the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, still intact, he understood immediately what his superiors would understand within the hour. They had been handed a gift. An intact bridge across the Rhine, the one thing Allied planners had assumed was impossible. Every bridge the Americans had approached in their advance across Germany had been destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces, often with devastating effectiveness. But here, through some combination of German confusion, poor communication, and failing infrastructure, was a bridge still standing. Timmerman did not wait for orders. He could see German troops on the far side, could see civilians still crossing, could see what looked like engineers working on something near the bridge towers. He understood that within minutes or hours the bridge would be gone. His orders were to advance to the Rhine, not to cross it. But orders in the chaos of mobile warfare are guidelines, and opportunities are fleeting. He radioed his company commander, who radioed battalion, who radioed division, and the response came back almost immediately: take the bridge if possible, at all costs. Captain Willy Brodge received his order to detonate the bridge at approximately 3:15 p.m. By that time, American tanks were already entering the western outskirts of Remagen, and infantry were dismounting from their half-tracks. Brodge turned the key on his detonation box and pressed the plunger. Nothing happened. He tried again, still nothing. The electrical firing system, cobbled together from inadequate materials by exhausted engineers, had failed.
He sent runners to the bridge to ignite the backup fuses manually, old-fashioned time delay fuses that would give German soldiers and fleeing civilians time to clear the span before the explosives detonated. The runners reached the bridge. They lit the fuses. They retreated to the eastern bank, and then, at 3:27 p.m., the charges detonated. The explosion was enormous, sending a plume of smoke and debris high above the Rhine, the concussion rattling windows in Remagen and shaking the ground beneath the feet of American soldiers advancing toward the river. For a moment, both sides assumed the bridge was gone. The Germans allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. At least they had denied the Americans this crossing. The Americans assumed their opportunity had vanished in that cloud of smoke and thunder. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge was still standing. Damaged, yes, crater holes in the wooden planking of the railway bed, twisted metal where one of the charges had blown a section of track skyward, but the main structure, the steel trusses and stone towers, remained intact. The demolition had failed. Whether through inadequate explosives, improper placement, or simply the robust over-engineering of a bridge built to withstand the weight of armored trains, the Ludendorff Bridge had survived. Lieutenant Timmerman, watching from the western approach, made his decision in seconds. He ordered his men forward. Across an intact but damaged bridge, under fire from German positions on the eastern bank, through smoke and confusion and the very real possibility that a second demolition attempt would succeed at any moment, the men of A Company 27th Armored Infantry Battalion began to cross the Rhine. The Germans, stunned by the failure of their demolition, recovered quickly and poured fire onto the bridge. Machine guns, rifles, anti-aircraft guns turned against ground targets. Anything that could shoot opened up on the Americans crossing the span. Timmerman led from the front, running across the wooden planking, leaping over gaps blown by the partial demolition, urging his men forward. Behind him came sergeants, corporals, privates, men who understood they were crossing not just a bridge, but a threshold. On the western side of the Rhine, they were part of an invasion force grinding slowly toward victory. On the eastern side, they would be inside Germany, inside the heartland, and nothing would stop them. At 4:10 p.m., Lieutenant Karl Timmerman became the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine since Napoleon. Within 30 minutes, his entire company was on the eastern bank, establishing a defensive perimeter. Within 2 hours, engineers were repairing the bridge to allow vehicle traffic. Within 12 hours, 5,000 American soldiers had crossed, and the bridgehead was secure. The Rhine, the Great Barrier, the last defensive line, had been breached, and the Germans, who had believed their river was secure, discovered that security is an illusion that shatters the moment someone has the audacity to test it.
The German reaction was immediate and catastrophic. When Adolf Hitler was informed that the Ludendorff Bridge had been captured intact, he flew into one of his characteristic rages. He demanded to know who was responsible. He ordered immediate counterattacks to retake the bridge. He commanded the Luftwaffe, which barely existed anymore as a functional fighting force, to destroy the bridge from the air. He activated commando units, frogmen armed with explosives, to swim the Rhine and blow the supports. He even authorized the use of V-2 rockets, strategic weapons designed to strike London, to target the bridge, marking the only time in the war that V-2s were used for tactical battlefield purposes. 5 German officers were court-martialed for the loss of the bridge. 3 were executed by firing squad within days. Captain Willy Brodtke, the engineer who had tried desperately to demolish the structure with inadequate resources and failing equipment, was not among those executed. He had been captured by American forces almost immediately after the bridge fell. But his immediate superior, the local commander, and several logistics officers were shot as scapegoats for a failure that was systemic, not individual. The bridge had been lost not because of one man's incompetence, but because the entire German war machine was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The Ludendorff Bridge became, in those frantic days of March 1945, the most attacked piece of infrastructure in Europe. The Luftwaffe flew over 300 sorties against it, losing dozens of aircraft to American anti-aircraft fire that had been concentrated around the crossing with unprecedented density. German artillery, positioned in the hills east of the Rhine, pounded the bridge continuously. Frogmen swam the freezing river under cover of darkness, attaching explosive charges to the stone pilings, but were intercepted by American combat engineers who established round-the-clock patrols in small boats. On March 17th, a V-2 rocket struck near the bridge, the first and only time American soldiers were killed by Germany's vaunted vengeance weapon, but the bridge held. And then, on March 17th at 3 p.m., 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. The constant shelling, the damage from the original German demolition attempt, and the stress of continuous heavy traffic finally exceeded the structure's capacity. The main span sagged, groaned, and then fell into the Rhine, taking with it 28 American engineers who were working on reinforcements. It was a tragedy, a loss of life, but by then it was also irrelevant. Because in those 10 days, the Americans had built multiple pontoon bridges alongside the damaged structure. They had ferried across tanks, artillery, and over 100,000 troops. The bridgehead was now 50 kilometers deep and expanding every hour. The Rhine had been crossed, Germany had been breached, and the myth of the secure river barrier had been exposed as exactly what it was, a myth.
The symbolic power of the Ludendorff Bridge extended far beyond its tactical value. For the German soldiers and civilians who witnessed its capture, the bridge represented the final proof that the war was lost. The Rhine was supposed to be impregnable. It was the last line. If the Rhine could not hold, then nothing could hold. The psychological impact rippled through what remained of German military morale. Units that might have fought desperately for weeks to defend river crossings instead surrendered or melted away. The belief that time could be bought, that the war could be prolonged, evaporated in the cold March air above Remagen. A German soldier named Josef Hartmann, positioned east of the Rhine as part of a reserve unit, wrote in his diary on March 8th, "We heard today that the Americans have crossed the Rhine at Remagen. The officers tell us we will counterattack, that we will throw them back, but no one believes it. If they have crossed the Rhine, then they can cross anything. There is no barrier left. There is no line that will hold them. The war is over, even if we must keep fighting. The war is over." For the Americans, the bridge became a symbol of something equally powerful: audacity rewarded. The crossing at Remagen was not part of the meticulously planned Operation Varsity, the massive airborne and amphibious assault scheduled for later in March further north. It was opportunistic, improvised, the result of junior officers making split-second decisions and senior commanders supporting them without hesitation. Lieutenant Timmerman's decision to cross the bridge, made without explicit orders to do so, exemplified the American military doctrine of decentralized initiative, the trust that junior leaders, faced with unexpected opportunities, would have the judgment to exploit them. The bridge also represented American industrial and logistical capacity. Within hours of the crossing, U.S. Army engineers had begun building pontoon bridges alongside the damaged Ludendorff span. They worked under constant fire, through day and night, with prefabricated components trucked forward from supply depots that stretched back across France to the Normandy beaches. When the original bridge collapsed, the pontoon bridges were already operational. When German artillery destroyed one pontoon bridge, engineers built another. The Rhine, which was supposed to halt the Americans for weeks, slowed them for less than a day. One recurring symbol emerged from the Remagen crossing that captured the contrast between German expectation and American reality: the simple matter of ammunition expenditure. German defenders counting their shots, rationing their bullets because supply lines had collapsed, were astonished by the American response to resistance. When German machine gun nests opened fire from the eastern towers of the bridge, American forces did not probe cautiously or attempt to silence them with precision fire. They simply called in artillery, massive, overwhelming barrages that reduced the towers to rubble within minutes. They called in air support, P-47 Thunderbolts that screamed down from the sky, dropping bombs and strafing anything that moved. The Americans did not count bullets. They did not ration shells. They had abundance, and they used it with devastating effect. A German officer captured during the fighting for the bridgehead remarked to his American interrogators, "You Americans don't fight like soldiers. You fight like accountants with unlimited budgets. Every problem you solve with more steel, more explosives, more machines. We fight to conserve ammunition. You fight as if ammunition is free. How can we compete with that?" The interrogator noted in his report, "Subject seems more demoralized by American material superiority than by tactical defeat. Indicates widespread recognition among German forces that war is economically unwinnable."
This was the deeper truth that the Ludendorff Bridge revealed. The Rhine was supposed to be secure not just because it was a river, but because the Germans believed their defensive preparations, their engineering, their willpower would be sufficient to hold it. But will and engineering could not compete with industrial capacity. When the bridge's demolition charges failed, there were no replacements. When German artillery tried to destroy the bridge from a distance, they ran out of ammunition within days. When the Luftwaffe attacked, they lost irreplaceable aircraft. The Americans, by contrast, simply built more bridges, fired more shells, flew more sorties. They could afford to lose. Germany could not. The transformation in German military thinking following the Remagen crossing was immediate and profound. Officers who had been planning desperate last stands at prepared defensive lines began surrendering their units intact. Soldiers who had been told the Rhine would save them deserted in increasing numbers. The propaganda that had sustained the Wehrmacht through years of retreat, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that the Allies would fracture, that German discipline would outlast Allied materialism, collapsed when the Rhine fell in a single afternoon. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who replaced von Rundstedt as commander in the West shortly after the Remagen disaster, later wrote in his memoirs, "The capture of the Remagen Bridge made the whole of our march preparations futile. The Americans succeeded in establishing a bridgehead of such dimensions that I was forced to commit over half my forces in a futile attempt to reduce it. This left insufficient strength to prevent additional crossings elsewhere. Once Remagen was lost, the Rhine defense was lost, and once the Rhine was lost, there remained no strategic barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany." For Captain Willy Brodtke, captured in the chaos of the bridge's fall, the experience brought a different kind of transformation. Interrogated by American intelligence officers, he was asked why the demolition had failed. He explained the inadequate explosives, the failing electrical system, the lack of proper materials. And then he said something that the interrogator recorded verbatim. "We were told we had the best equipment, the best training, the best engineers. But when the moment came, we had old dynamite, faulty wire, and no backup plan. Everything was a lie. The bridge was not secure. Nothing was secure. We built our war on confidence and discovered too late that confidence without capacity is worthless." The interrogator noted, "Subject appears broken, not by capture, but by disillusionment, blames German leadership, not American tactics, for defeat."
The Battle of Remagen, as it came to be known, continued for 10 days as the Americans expanded their bridgehead against desperate German counterattacks. Over 3,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded trying to eliminate the crossing.
American casualties were lighter, but still significant. Over 1,000 killed or wounded holding the bridgehead against artillery, air attacks, and armor counterstrikes. But every casualty the Germans suffered was irreplaceable. Every tank they lost in futile attacks on the bridgehead was a tank that could not defend Berlin. Every artillery shell they fired at Remagen was a shell they would not have when the Soviets closed in from the east. By March 24th, just 17 days after Timmerman's crossing, American forces had advanced so far beyond the Rhine that Remagen was a rear area. The massive Operation Varsity assault across the Rhine near Wessel proceeded as planned, but its success was anticlimactic. The Germans had already exhausted their reserves trying to contain the Remagen bridgehead. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British and Canadian forces that executed Varsity, later admitted with characteristic reluctance that Remagen had simplified our task considerably by drawing German forces away from his planned crossing sites. The Ludendorff Bridge, or what remained of it after the collapse, was never rebuilt. The stone towers still stand today, converted into a museum called the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen, dedicated to reconciliation and the documentation of war's futility. But the ghost of the bridge lingers in military history as a case study in how wars are lost not through single catastrophic defeats, but through the accumulation of small failures. Failed explosives, failed communication, failed logistics, failed leadership. Josef Hartmann, the German soldier who had written in his diary that the war was over when the Americans crossed the Rhine, surrendered to American forces on April 12, 1945. He was 20 years old. In his interrogation, he was asked what moment he realized Germany would lose the war. He said, "When I heard about Remagen. We were told the Rhine would hold. We were told we had time. But when the Americans crossed in a single day, I understood that we had been living in a fantasy. The Rhine was supposed to save us, but the Rhine was just a river, and rivers can be crossed." The legacy of the Ludendorff Bridge extends beyond its immediate military impact. It stands as a monument to the danger of strategic assumptions. The Germans assumed the Rhine was secure because they wanted it to be secure, because their war plans required it to be secure, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. But assumptions are not fortifications. Will is not preparedness, and confidence unmoored from capability is simply delusion. The Americans, by contrast, demonstrated the value of flexibility and initiative. They had not planned to cross at Remagen. It was not in any operational order. But when the opportunity presented itself, they seized it immediately, without hesitation, without bureaucratic delay. Junior officers made decisions that senior officers supported. Risks were taken, and fortune favored the bold, as it so often does in war.
Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the man who led the first crossing, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. He survived the war but died young, at age 36, of a heart condition possibly related to the stress he endured during those frantic hours on the bridge. In his later interviews, he downplayed his role, insisting he had simply done what any officer in his position would have done. But the historical record suggests otherwise. Many officers, faced with a damaged bridge under fire and without explicit orders to cross, would have waited, would have radioed for instructions, would have conducted reconnaissance. Timmerman ran. Captain Willie Bratch spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi. He returned to Germany in 1947 and lived quietly until his death in 1984. He never blamed his captors, never expressed bitterness about his role in one of Germany's most decisive defeats. He simply said, when asked about it, that he had done his best with what he had, and it had not been enough.
and that perhaps it was appropriate that it had not been enough, because the cause he had served was not worth the lives it consumed. The Rhine flows still, cold and gray, past the ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge. Tourists come to see the towers, to read the plaques, to imagine what it must have been like on that March afternoon when history turned on a failed demolition and a lieutenant's audacity. The river, which was supposed to protect Germany, could not protect against determination, against capacity, against the simple fact that no barrier is secure if the will to cross it is strong enough and the means to cross it are available. The Germans thought the Rhine was secure. They built their last hopes on that security, and in a single afternoon those hopes collapsed into the cold water of the river they had trusted to save them. The bridge fell to American hands, not because the Americans were supermen, but because they were willing to take the risk, willing to exploit the opportunity, willing to cross a damaged span under fire in pursuit of victory. And the Germans, for all their engineering and planning and confidence, were not willing or able to stop them. In the end, security is not built on rivers or bridges or demolition charges. It is built on capacity, on will, on the ability to adapt when plans fail. The Ludendorff Bridge was supposed to fall into the Rhine and deny the Americans their crossing. Instead, it fell to American hands and opened the road to the heart of Germany. And with it fell the last illusion that will alone, without means, could sustain a lost cause. The Rhine was never secure. It was only ever a river, and rivers, in the end, always yield to those with the strength and courage to cross them.